But now, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has renewed her calls for another referendum on Scottish independence. She's been celebrating today with newly elected SNP members of Parliament in Dundee. And in a phone call with Boris Johnson, she made it clear she believes the general election results in Scotland give her a clear mandate for another referendum.
I was very firm with him that I have a mandate to offer people a choice. He reiterated his opposition to that, but, you know, let's focus on reality here. The election this week was a watershed moment for Scotland. Scotland very clearly wants a different future to the one that's been chosen by much of the rest of the UK, and Scotland wants to have the right to choose its own future.
Let's join Jess Sargeant, who you can see there, who has authored a report on Scottish independence. Very good afternoon. Thank you for your time today. So, both Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson have got clear mandates to lead, so we seem deadlocked on the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in order for the Scottish Government to be able to hold the independence referendum that it wants to hold, it needs the power to do so. And so the UK Government will need to agree to devolve that power like it did ahead of the 2014 referendum. Now, although Nicola Sturgeon claims she's got a clear mandate from the 2019 general election result, Boris Johnson's described the first independence referendum as a once-in-a-generation opportunity. So it doesn't look like he's going to grant that power anytime soon. However, if parties in Scotland, nationalist parties, continue to win elections, it's going to become much harder to sustain that position in the long run.
And in fact, both of them digging their heels in last night during this phone call when neither of them were going to budge. They both made clear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is going to be a big argument coming forward. So Nicola Sturgeon yesterday said that next week she was going to set out her case for why Scotland should have the power to decide whether there is an independence referendum and on what timetable. So the UK government will have to come up with a response to that. And it might not be enough just to say that now's not the time, like Theresa May did in 2017. They might have to respond to the arguments Nicola Sturgeon's likely to make about that it should be for Scotland to determine Scotland's future.
Is there any way Nicola Sturgeon can potentially get around the law and this permission that the UK Prime Minister will have to grant?
Yeah, so back before the first independence referendum, there was quite a strong legal debate about exactly how a referendum could take place legally. There were some legal experts who suggested that because holding a referendum on independence wasn't actually, trying to do independence, that they could hold that referendum just as a kind of consultative vote. So it could be, if we get to that point, that the Scottish Parliament could try and introduce a bill just to hold that referendum, to say that we're not encroaching on UK powers because we're not actually trying to do independence, we're just holding a vote. But it's likely that any bill that would do that would be challenged in court and probably potentially struck down.
And whatever happens, is going to be such a lengthy process. We wouldn't see any kind of vote for a number of years, presumably. Yeah,
absolutely. So Nicola Sturgeon's preferred timetable is to hold a referendum in 2020. In our report, we argue that that's not necessarily a good idea. So last time it was 3 years between the principle being agreed that there could be a second independence referendum, a first independence referendum, to that vote actually being held. There's lots of negotiations that will need to take place. There's lots of details that will need to be agreed. They'll have to introduce legislation. There'll need to be time for the campaign. So 2020 is quite a tight timetable, not to mention the fact that we're unlikely to have clarity on Brexit by then. And a lot of the kind of shape of the trade deal between the UK and the EU will have bearings on the debate around Scottish independence, particularly around the border. So we advise that 2020 is too soon for a second vote.
You've studied these things. Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP would argue there's a clear mandate and a clear wish for the people of Scotland to split from the UK. But is there, according to what you've analysed?
I mean, it's certainly still debatable as to exactly what is a mandate, essentially. What we do say in our report is that if there's a nationalist majority in the 2021 Scottish Parliament elections, it'll be much harder for the UK government to continue to make the case that the Scottish Parliament shouldn't be allowed to hold an independence referendum. So exactly when the right threshold for that mandate is up for debate. It's subjective, but certainly I think 2021 will be a key test of the Scottish will.
And let's look ahead then to the end of next year, say the start of 2021. Arguably, we are supposed to have reached a trade agreement, a Brexit trade agreement, but that may drag on. Will Boris Johnson have to sort of give in and accept that this is the will north of the border?
I mean, certainly the imperatives here are political rather than legal. It will depend on how much political pressure he's under. But it's interesting that actually, previous Scottish secretaries of state, so for example, Alistair Jack, have mentioned 2021 as a key date. And so it's likely that after that point has passed, after the Scottish Parliament elections were held in May, if there is a nationalist majority, then really I think Boris Johnson will it will be much harder for him to resist a request for the power to hold an independence referendum.
And after Ruth Davidson departed as Conservative leader in Scotland, will that have any effect, or has that had any effect on any kind of call for Indy Ref 2?
I mean, certainly the Scottish Conservatives did not do well in the general election. They lost 7 seats. They now just retain, I think the number's 6. And so there's a big question as to whether that's down to Ruth Davidson personally. Obviously, she was very good at reaching voters in Scotland who wouldn't necessarily vote Conservative, or whether it's more about Brexit. Obviously, Scotland as a country voted to remain. But I think there is concern perhaps amongst unionists. She was quite a strong unionist voice in resisting clearly a second independence referendum. I think without her, I think there is concern amongst unionists that it might be harder to win some people over.
Well, we'll have to see what happens, of course. Jess Sargeant, many thanks indeed for joining us today.
Thanks.